the moment Stella Whitfield walked into the dusty town of Redemption Creek, Texas, in the spring of 1878. Every man on the main street stopped what he was doing and stared, not because she was beautiful, though she was, but because she walked like a woman who had already buried everything worth losing and had decided to keep walking anyway. She came in on the afternoon stage from San Antonio, her single trunk strapped to the back of the coach, her dark hair pinned up beneath a wide-brimmed hat that had seen better years, and her gray eyes set straight ahead with the kind of quiet determination that comes not from courage, but from the absolute refusal to feel anything more than necessary. She was 26 years old, and she had the bearing of someone who had lived twice that amount of life inside those years. Redemption Creek was not a grand town by any measure. It had a general store run by a broad-shouldered German man named Otto Haas, a church that leaned slightly to the east as though listening for something, a saloon called the Broken Spur, a sheriff's office that looked more like a tool shed with ambition, and a scattering of houses and homesteads that spread out into the surrounding Texas hill country like seeds dropped carelessly from an open hand. The town had roughly 300 souls in and around it, most of them ranchers, farmers, or people who had come west with one dream and were presently living inside an entirely different one. Stella had come to Redemption Creek for a job. The local schoolhouse needed a teacher, and she had answered the advertisement placed in the San Antonio paper by the town's small board of education, which consisted of 3 ranchers and the preacher. She had a teaching certificate from a school in Virginia, and she had taught for 2 years in San Antonio before a series of events that she did not discuss with anyone had caused her to need to start entirely over somewhere new, somewhere far enough away that memory would have to work very hard to find her. She climbed down from the stage and looked at the town, and the town looked back at her, and she pressed her lips together and picked up her carpetbag and walked toward the hotel to find a room. It was during this short walk, no more than 40 yards along the main street's wooden boardwalk, that she first saw Andrew Ellsworth. He was coming out of the general store with a 50-pound sack of flour over one shoulder and a coil of rope over the other, and he nearly walked straight into her, because he was looking back over his shoulder at Otto Haas, who was calling something after him about an order of fence nails. He pulled up short just in time, the flour sack swaying on his shoulder, and the two of them stood 2 feet apart on the boardwalk, while the Texas afternoon settled its warm golden light over both of them like it was perfectly satisfied with what it had arranged. He was 29, tall in the particular way that ranching men get tall, which is to say not just height but an overall sense of being built for the outdoors, with broad shoulders and a jaw that had been shaved recently but was already thinking about not cooperating, and dark brown eyes that had a quality to them she would not immediately be able to name but would eventually understand was simple, uncomplicated honesty. He wore a worn canvas jacket, denim trousers, boots that had walked a great many miles, and a battered hat that he immediately swept off his head the moment he registered that he had nearly knocked a woman down. "Beg your pardon, ma'am," he said, and his voice was low and steady, the kind of voice that belonged to someone who did not use many words but meant all of the ones he chose. "I wasn't watching where I was going." "Neither was I," Stella said, and her own voice was cool and even, and she stepped around him and kept walking toward the hotel. Andrew Ellsworth stood there on the boardwalk for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, watching her go, and then he put his hat back on and went to load the flour sack into his wagon. He did not know yet that she was the most important person he would ever meet. He did not know that she would take everything he thought he understood about love and rearrange it completely. He only knew that she walked like someone who was carrying a great weight invisible to the eye, and that, for reasons he could not explain, he felt something stir in his chest that had been very quiet for a very long time. Stella settled into Redemption Creek with quiet efficiency. She took a room at the hotel for 2 weeks while the small schoolhouse was aired out and repaired, its windows replaced, and its roof patched where winter had gotten into it. She met the members of the school board, 3 ranchers named Purvis, McAllen, and Denton, and the preacher, a kind-eyed older man named Reverend Holt, and she answered their questions about her qualifications and her experience with precise, polite answers that gave them everything they needed to know professionally and absolutely nothing personal. She started teaching on a Tuesday morning in early April, with 14 students ranging from age 6 to 15, and within 1 week, the entire town had heard that the new school teacher was remarkable. She was patient with the younger children and rigorous with the older ones, and she had a way of explaining things that made the difficult seem approachable without making it seem simple. She was fair and consistent and never raised her voice, and the children respected her in the way that children respect someone who takes them seriously. The women of Redemption Creek tried to befriend her with the standard instruments of frontier community life, which included invitations to quilting circles, offers of pie, and the kind of transparent curiosity about her past that was dressed up as friendly conversation. Stella accepted the pie, declined the quilting circles, and deflected the curiosity with such graceful skill that most women came away from a conversation with her feeling vaguely that they had learned a great deal about her when in fact they had learned almost nothing. She had been in Redemption Creek for 3 weeks when the circumstances of frontier life first brought her into extended contact with Andrew Ellsworth. He ran the Ellsworth Ranch, which was 7 miles outside of town, a cattle operation he had built himself over the past 5 years on land he had bought from a retiring homesteader. He had a foreman named Cole Briggs and 2 cowboys who worked for him seasonally, and the ranch was beginning to do well enough that he was cautiously optimistic about its future. He came into town once a week for supplies and any needed business, and he was the kind of man that Redemption Creek liked and trusted, the quiet, steady, capable kind who did what he said, and said what he meant, and never caused trouble. He came to the schoolhouse because his nephew was one of Stella's students. His sister, Clara, had married a man named Tom Waverly, and they had a homestead 4 miles from Andrew's ranch. Their eldest child, a boy of 10 named James, had been riding to school in town since January, but in the 3rd week of April he had gotten into a fight with another boy over something Andrew never did quite understand, and Stella had sent a note home saying she needed to speak with a parent or guardian. Clara was heavily pregnant with her 2nd child and could not make the ride easily, so Andrew had driven in. He knocked on the schoolhouse door after the children had gone home for the day. Stella was at the blackboard, erasing the day's arithmetic problems, and she turned at the knock and saw him filling the doorframe, hat in hand, and for just a fraction of a second something moved in her expression, though she smoothed it away before he could read it. "Mr. Ellsworth," she said, "I believe you're here about James." "Yes, ma'am," he said. "My sister sent her apologies. She's near her time and the ride would have been hard on her." "Please come in," Stella said, and she set down her eraser and moved to her desk and sat down in the manner of a professional who is firmly in her own domain. "And please sit down." He sat in the chair across from her desk, the one she kept there for exactly this kind of meeting, and he held his hat in both hands and gave her his full, quiet attention. "James is a bright boy," Stella began, because she believed in giving credit before correction. "He learns quickly, he reads above his age level, and when he is engaged, he is one of the most curious students I have. The difficulty is that he has a temper, and when he feels he has been wronged or embarrassed, he responds physically before he responds with words." Andrew nodded slowly. "I know, he's had that trouble before. What happened?" Stella explained the incident, which involved another boy making a mocking comment about James's clothes, and James responding by hitting the other boy with his lunch pail. She explained it calmly and without blame, and Andrew listened to everything without interrupting. "I'd like your help," Stella said when she had finished. "Not to discipline him, he's had enough of that. I'd like to work with him on other ways to handle moments like that." but it helps when the adults in a child's life are working in the same direction. Is there something at home that might be contributing to his feeling that he has to defend himself so forcefully? Andrew was quiet for a moment. He turned his hat in his hands, a slow rotation. His father has had a hard year, he said finally. Crop failure last summer. They're not in a desperate place, but it's been tight, and James knows more about it than a 10-year-old probably should. He's been wearing the same coat since last winter. Kids notice these things about each other. Stella's expression shifted very slightly, not into pity, but into understanding. I see. That's very helpful, Mr. Ellsworth. I'll be more mindful of how I structure group activities to minimize moments where differences in circumstance become visible. Andrew looked at her. He looked at her the way a person looks at something that has surprised them in a way they didn't expect. That's a thoughtful thing to think about, he said. It's my job to think about these things, she said, and it was not a cold reply, but it was a contained one. He stood to leave and then stopped. Miss Whitfield, he said, is there anything James's family can do from their end to support what you're working on with him? She considered this for a moment. Have someone he trusts talk to him about the difference between being strong and being reactive. He's old enough to understand that distinction if it's explained with respect rather than correction. Andrew nodded. I can do that, he said. I'll talk to him this week. Thank you, Stella said. That will make a real difference. He put his hat on and turned to go, and at the door he turned back one more time. You're good at this, Miss Whitfield, he said. Teaching. It was said simply, without flattery, as a plain observation of fact, and something about its plainness made it land differently than compliments usually did. Thank you, Mr. Ellsworth, she said, and this time her voice was just slightly warmer than professional, and she looked back down at her papers before either of them had to decide what to do with that. He came back the following week, not because he had business at the schoolhouse, but because he had driven James into town for school and had stopped in to let her know that he had talked to his nephew and that James had listened well and had even asked some thoughtful questions about it. He stood in the doorway rather than coming in because school was about to start, and he delivered this information, and she received it, and they stood there a moment past the end of the conversation without quite ending it. How are you settling into Redemption Creek? He asked. It was the kind of question anyone might ask a newcomer, but there was something behind it that was not quite casual. Well enough, she said. It's quieter than San Antonio. Is that good or bad? She thought about this with more seriousness than the question perhaps required. Good, she said finally. Quiet is good. He nodded, and she could see him wanting to ask more and choosing not to, and she appreciated that restraint more than he could have known. I'll let you get to your day, he said. Thank you for talking to James, she said. He touched the brim of his hat and went, and she watched from the window as he walked to his wagon in the morning light, and she felt something she did not want to feel and pressed it firmly down where it could not cause trouble. May came in warm and sweet-smelling, the hill country blooming with color in the way that Texas does in spring before the summer heat settles in like an uninvited permanent guest. The wildflowers were everywhere, bluebonnets and Indian paintbrush covering the slopes and meadows around town, and the whole countryside looked like something a painter would have invented rather than a place real people actually lived. Andrew Ellsworth found reasons to be in town more than once a week in May. He told himself it was the increased supply needs of spring calving season, which was not untrue, but it was not the whole truth either. The whole truth was that he had started looking for her when he came to town, the slim figure in the practical dark skirt and the white shirtwaist, walking to or from the schoolhouse or the store or the hotel where she still boarded, and when he found her his day felt differently organized, as though something had been confirmed that he needed to check on. He began finding natural occasions to speak to her. He saw her at the general store one afternoon, struggling with a box of school supplies that Otto Haas had ordered for her, a delivery of chalk, slate boards, and a new geography book, and he appeared at her elbow and said, "May I help with that?" And she looked at him for a moment and said, "I'm capable of carrying it," and he said, "I know you are. I'm asking if you'd like company carrying it." And something about this reply made the corner of her mouth move in a way that was not quite a smile but was in its general neighborhood, and she said, "All right," and he carried the box to the schoolhouse. They talked about the geography book the whole 4-minute walk. He had never been east of the Mississippi, but he had read maps the way other men read the Bible, with faith and intensity and a kind of personal investment in what was described there. And she had grown up in Virginia and had traveled to Texas from there. And they compared what the map said about the country between those 2 points with what she had actually experienced of it. And it was a completely ordinary conversation about geography and travel and distance. And neither of them said anything that was not in itself perfectly simple, and yet by the time they arrived at the schoolhouse they had shared something that felt, to both of them, like more than a walk with a box. "Thank you, Mr. Ellsworth," she said. "Andrew," he said, not a correction, just a quiet offer. She looked at him for a moment. "Andrew," she said, and the word in her mouth was careful, as though she were testing its weight. "Stella," he said, and it was so natural and so right that she had to look away. "I should get these inside before the afternoon," she said. "Of course," he said. "Good day, Stella." She went in, and he stood on the front step of the schoolhouse for just a moment longer than he needed to before he turned and walked back toward his wagon and the long ride home. Spring moved towards summer, and the friendship between Stella Whitfield and Andrew Ellsworth grew in the deliberate, careful way that both of them seemed to require, neither pushing nor retreating, simply existing in the space between two people who are learning the dimensions of each other. They shared Sunday dinners occasionally at the hotel's dining room, which was the most respectable social occasion Redemption Creek offered for 2 unattached adults. And the town noticed this and drew its conclusions and gossiped warmly, as small towns do. And Stella heard the gossip through the wives of her school board members and said nothing. And Andrew heard it from his foreman Cole Briggs, who was a cheerful, red-faced man with enormous opinions about everything, and said nothing either. And they continued having their Sunday dinners. They talked about everything except the things that mattered most. They talked about her students and his cattle and the weather patterns and the political situation in Washington and the price of beef and whether the new railroad spur that was being discussed would come close enough to Redemption Creek to matter, and what she thought of Texas compared to Virginia, and what he thought of Virginia based on everything he had ever read about it. They were careful and interested and genuinely engaged with each other's minds, and beneath all of it, like a river running under solid ground, was something neither of them was yet naming. It was on one of these Sunday evenings in the last days of June that Andrew made the mistake of asking too personal a question, not because the question was wrong, but because the timing had not been right, and she had not yet decided how far to let him in. They were walking back from the hotel dining room to her boarding house, which she had moved into from the hotel in May when a room had opened up with Mrs. Delia Cole, a widow who kept a tidy house and good conversation, and the evening was warm and full of stars, and the cicadas were beginning their summer commentary, and Andrew had said, easily and without premeditation, "What brought you to Texas, Stella? From Virginia, I mean. What was it that made you come so far?" The silence that followed was different from their usual silences, which were companionable. This one had an edge to it. He felt it immediately. "Teaching opportunities," she said, and the words were so carefully neutral they were almost nothing at all. He glanced at her profile in the darkness and understood that he had touched something closed. "Of course," he said simply, and did not press, and changed the subject to something about James's progress in school, and she answered him with relief that she could hear in her own voice and hated slightly. At her boarding-house door she stopped and turned to him, and the lamplight from inside the house caught the side of her face, and she looked at him with an expression he could not entirely read. "Andrew," she said. "Yes," she seemed to be deciding something. "I want you to know that I value these evenings, your company, the conversations." She paused. "And I want you to know that I am not that I cannot." She stopped again. He waited. "I'm not the kind of person who is available for the things that I think you might be hoping for," she said, and the honesty of it was so clean and so difficult that he could see what it cost her. He stood very still for a moment, and the night was quiet around them, and the stars were doing what they always do, which is existing at such an impossible distance that all human suffering and human hope looks the same size from there. "What kind of person are you, then?" he asked, and his voice was so gentle that it had no barbs in it at all. "A tired one," she said. "One who has used up most of what she had." He nodded slowly. He was thinking about his next words very carefully, she could see that, and the care he took made her feel something dangerous. "All right," he said. "I hear what you're telling me, and I'm not asking you for anything you can't give." He paused. "But I'll tell you something honestly, Stella. I like who you are. I like your company. I like your mind and the way you think and the way you talk about things. If friendship is what's on offer, I'll take it, and I won't stand here making it complicated." She looked at him for a long moment. "It may always only be friendship," she said, and the word always was carrying a great deal of weight when she said it. "I understand," he said, and then very quietly, "Let me offer enough for both of us." She heard those words, and something in her chest moved, a slow, painful movement, like something that had been frozen beginning reluctantly to thaw. "Andrew," she said, and his name in her voice had something raw in it. "Good night, Stella," he said, and he touched his hat and walked back into the evening, and she stood at the door and watched him go and pressed her hand briefly and lightly against her sternum as though she could hold whatever was moving there still. She did not sleep easily that night. She lay in her narrow bed in Mrs. Cole's boarding house and listened to the Texas night outside her window and thought about a man in Richmond, Virginia, and a marriage that had lasted 14 months and ended in a way that had left her with a grief she could not mourn properly because the world had not understood it as a grief worth mourning. His name had been Richard Whitfield, and they had been young, and she had believed in love with the whole open architecture of a young woman who has not yet learned what belief can cost, and he had died of fever in the winter of 1875, and she had been pregnant, and she had lost the child also, within 2 weeks of losing him, and then she had been alone in a way that had no adequate description in any language she had ever studied. She had picked herself up because there was nothing else to do with herself. She had gone back to teaching. She had moved to San Antonio when the memories of Richmond became too dense to breathe in. And she had arrived at a conclusion about herself that she held with the quiet conviction of someone who has stopped arguing with the truth. She did not have love to give anymore. It had gone somewhere during those 2 weeks in 1875, and she had not been able to find it since. She could give competence and care and fairness and conversation, and she gave all of those things generously. But the particular terrible tenderness of being fully open to another human being felt like a country she had traveled to once and been exiled from. She thought about Andrew Ellsworth and his dark, honest eyes and his careful words, and the way he had said, "Let me offer enough for both of us." And she thought, this man is going to be a problem. July arrived with its famous Texas violence of heat, and the town of Redemption Creek moved through its days with the slow, deliberate rhythm of people who have learned to conserve energy in the face of a relentless sun. Stella adapted by starting school an hour earlier and ending an hour earlier, which the children appreciated and the parents approved, and she spent her afternoons in the relative shade of the boarding house porch, reading or preparing her lessons for the next day. Andrew continued to find ways to cross her path in ways that were not manufactured, but were also not entirely accidental, and she continued to find that she was glad when he did, and the gladness continued to alarm her, and she continued to do nothing about either the gladness or the alarm, because both felt like things she could manage as long as she did not examine them too directly. In late July, Andrew's sister Clara had her baby, a boy they named Thomas, and Clara recovered well and their household adjusted to its new addition with the usual combination of exhaustion and joy. And James at school was noticeably happier and calmer as his father's situation improved and the family's balance was restored. Stella noticed the improvement in James and mentioned it to Andrew one Sunday evening, and Andrew smiled in a way she had not seen him smile before, a full, warm smile that changed his whole face and was addressed entirely at her, and she felt it in her solar plexus and looked down at her coffee cup. It was in early August that Redemption Creek had a small crisis that brought Stella and Andrew into an unexpected shared territory. A family arrived from the east, a widow named Martha Doane with her 4 children, the oldest of whom was 13, and they were in difficult circumstances, having lost their farm in Missouri and made the journey west on very little, and they settled in a one-room shack on the edge of town that had been abandoned for 2 years. The widow was proud and work-willing, but the children were underfed, and the situation was plainly precarious. Stella became aware of the situation through her students, specifically through the 2 older Doane children who appeared in her classroom on their second day in Redemption Creek, thin and watchful and wearing clothes that were barely adequate for the summer heat, let alone what would come in the fall. She fed them from her own lunch that first week and said nothing about it, and she went to see the Reverend Holt and asked what the community's plan was for the Doanes, and Reverend Holt, who was a genuinely good man, said he had already been thinking about it and would she be willing to help organize some assistance. She said she would, and the assistance she organized was practical, specific, and completely without sentimentality. She went to Otto Haas and the other merchants and made a case for extending the widow credit until she could find work. She went to the women's prayer circle at the church and arranged for a rotation of meals to be delivered to the Doane household. She found Martha Doane a job doing laundry for 2 of the wealthier ranching families in the area, which brought in a small but reliable income. Andrew Ellsworth heard about this through the normal channels of town information, which in Redemption Creek were both efficient and thorough, and he arrived at the schoolhouse one afternoon at the end of the day with a wagon loaded with firewood, dried beans, a bag of cornmeal, and a bolt of plain calico that could be made into children's clothes, and he said simply, "I heard there was a family in need." Stella stood in the schoolhouse doorway and looked at the wagon and then at him. "They won't take charity easily," she said. "I know," he said. "I thought maybe it could come from the school, supplies for the children. Martha Doane doesn't have to know exactly who provided it." Stella looked at him for a long moment, and the look on her face was something she could not fully control. It was the look of a person who has been surprised into admiration. "That's a kind thought," she said. "It's a practical one," he said. "Same outcome, less pride damaged." "Both things can be true," she said. "Yes," he agreed. "They can." She helped him unload the wagon, and they walked the supplies over to the Doane house together in the early evening, and they presented them in exactly the way Andrew had suggested, as school supplies for the children and community provisions through the church. And Martha Doane, who was a dignified woman with tired eyes and a straight back, accepted them in that spirit and thanked them both with a composure that suggested she understood the kindness beneath the framing and was choosing to honor it by not pointing at it directly. Walking back from the Doane house in the long August evening, the heat finally beginning to ease toward something almost comfortable, Stella said, without looking at him, "You're a good man, Andrew Ellsworth." He walked quietly beside her for a moment. "I try to be," he said. "I mean it as more than a general observation," she said. "I mean it specifically, about who you are." He glanced at her. In the sideways light of late afternoon she looked, for just a moment, exactly as young as she was, without the armor she usually wore, and he felt something in his chest that he had been feeling for months now fold itself open like a map that had been kept rolled up too long. "Thank you, Stella," he said quietly. She did not say anything else, but she walked a little closer to him for the rest of the way back to the main street, close enough that their arms occasionally almost touched, and she did not move away when that happened. August gave way to September, and September brought the beginning of the school year's second term and cooler mornings, and the particular quality of light that the Texas Hill Country gets in early fall, amber and low and full of something that felt, to Stella, simultaneously like ending and beginning. She had been in Redemption Creek for nearly 5 months. She had expected to find a temporary resting place, a town to recoup herself in before moving on to something she could not yet name. Instead, she had found herself beginning to have roots, small ones, but roots, the kind that come not from choosing a place but from gradually being held by one. Her students knew her now, and she knew them, their individual rhythms and needs, and the particular way each of them came at a problem, and she had adapted her teaching to this specific group of 14 children in a way that could not be picked up and applied elsewhere without loss. Mrs. Delia Cole had become a genuine friend in the quiet, steady way that friendship develops between women who respect each other and ask nothing excessive. The Reverend Holt had invited her to help with a literacy program for 2 adult residents of the town who had never learned to read, and she had agreed, and this work had given her something she had not expected, a feeling of being genuinely embedded in a place. And there was Andrew. Andrew, who came to town once and sometimes twice a week, and who always, without making a thing of it, found his way to where she was. Andrew, who had learned which questions she would answer and which she would deflect, and who asked only the former and waited patiently on the latter. Andrew, who had taken to leaving small things for her, not romantic gifts, nothing that could be called such, but practical things. Once a jar of honey from a neighbor's bees that he mentioned was particularly good. Once a small wrapped parcel of dried herbs that Mrs. Holt had put together knowing the schoolteacher was prone to headaches in the heat, and he had delivered it as a passing thing, as though the kindness were incidental. Once in September, a small book of poetry that he had ordered through Otto Haas because she had mentioned, in passing, on a Sunday evening 4 weeks prior, that she missed having access to a good bookshop. That last one had nearly undone her. She had opened it and seen that he had found a collection by an author she had mentioned specifically and without emphasis, mentioned once, in the middle of a larger conversation about city life versus frontier life, and she had stood in her room at the boarding house holding the book and felt something crack very quietly inside her chest. She had gone to find him. He had been in front of the general store about to load his wagon for the drive home, and she had come across the street holding the book, and he had seen her coming and gone still. "You remembered," she said. "It was not quite an accusation and not quite a wonder. It was somewhere between." "You mentioned it," he said. "Once," she said. "You remembered something I mentioned once." He looked at her steadily. "I remember most things you say," he said. She stood there in the middle of the main street of Redemption Creek in September of 1878 with a book of poetry in her hands and the afternoon light falling around her, and she looked at this man and felt everything she had been managing so carefully for months rise up with a force that frightened her. "Andrew," she said. "Yes. I need to tell you something." He waited. She came a step closer, lowering her voice, though there was no one near enough to hear. "I had a husband," she said. "He died 3 years ago. We lost a child also at the same time." She said it plainly, the way she had learned to say it, with the minimum of inflection that would allow the words to be said without breaking her. "I am not telling you this because I want your pity. I am telling you because you deserve to know why I am the way I am with you, why I keep—" She searched for the word, "pulling back." Andrew looked at her, and his expression was very still and very careful, and what was in it was not pity. It was something quieter and more serious than pity. "Thank you for telling me," he said. "I told you before that I couldn't offer love," she said. "I meant it. It's not something I say to protect myself from you, it's true. Something in me went quiet after all of that, and it hasn't come back. I don't know if it can." She paused. "And I think you should know that clearly so that you can make an informed decision about how much time to spend in my company." He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the book in her hands and then at her face. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Yes. When you're with me." On Sunday evenings or walking back from the Doan house or in the schoolhouse doorway, when you're with me, how does it feel?" She opened her mouth and then closed it again. She looked away. "It feels like the only time I'm not carrying it," she said finally, very quietly, and the admission was clearly hard one. "Then something is happening," he said. "It might be quiet, it might be slow, but something is happening." "Andrew," she said, and her voice had a warning in it. "I know," he said. "I'm not pushing, I promise I'm not." He paused. "I'm just telling you that I see you, and I'm not going anywhere. And if all you ever have is today and Sunday evenings and walking home and books I remember to order, then that's what I'll take, and I'll count myself lucky." He held her gaze. "You don't have to love me to be loved, Stella." She stared at him. The street was quiet around them, and the September sky was huge and bright above the rooftops of Redemption Creek, and everything was very still. "That is a dangerous thing to say," she said. "I know," he said, and the corner of his mouth moved very slightly. She looked down at the book in her hands and then back up at him. "Thank you," she said, "for the book and for the rest of it." "Go read your poetry," he said gently. She went. October arrived, and with it the first real chill of autumn, and the leaves on the creekside oaks turned color, and the mornings began to require coats, and the town of Redemption Creek settled into the comfortable rhythms of the cooler season. Fires were lit in the evenings, and the smell of wood smoke became a constant thread in the air, and people moved a little slower and a little closer together the way people do when the warmth of summer is no longer automatic and must be made. It was in October that things between Stella and Andrew began to shift in ways she had less and less power to manage, not because he pushed, but because he was simply, continuously, unmistakably present, and she was beginning to understand that his presence was not something she could categorize as merely friendship and leave it there. It had grown too large for that container. He had dinner one Sunday at Mrs. Cole's boarding house, invited by Mrs. Cole herself, who was a not particularly subtle woman who liked Andrew Ellsworth and thought the schoolteacher needed someone to look after her. Stella had arrived home from an errand to find him already seated at Mrs. Cole's table being served coffee and biscuits, and the look on her face when she saw him must have been eloquent because Mrs. Cole went very busy with something in the kitchen, with a great deal of poorly concealed satisfaction. They had eaten dinner together at Mrs. Cole's table, the three of them, and the meal had been warm and good and full of conversation, and afterward Mrs. Cole had conveniently remembered something she needed to attend to, and left Stella and Andrew alone in the sitting room with the fire going and 2 cups of coffee. They sat across from each other in the firelight, and for a while they talked in their usual way, careful and engaged and alive with the quality of attention they always gave each other. And then there was a pause in the conversation that was different from their usual pauses, heavier and more charged, and Stella looked at the fire and then at him and said, before she could stop herself, "I'm frightened of this." He didn't pretend not to know what she meant. "I know," he said. "Of what it would mean to let it matter," she said. "If it mattered and then something happened, I don't think I could manage that again." "Something could always happen," he said. "That's been true your whole life, Stella, and it was true before you knew it was true." He leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees, and his face in the firelight was so serious and so kind that she had to make a physical effort not to look away. "But I'll tell you what I know. I know that I think about you every day. I know that the days I see you are better than the days I don't. I know that what I feel for you is the realest thing I've felt in a very long time, and I am not asking you to match it, and I am not putting conditions on it, and I am not going to use it to make you feel obligated or pressed." He held her gaze. "I'm just telling you what's true, so you know, so you can decide with full information." Stella looked at him for a long time. The fire crackled between them, and outside the wind was picking up around the eaves of the house, and the October night was pressing its cold blue self against the windows. "What if I can't give you what you deserve?" she said. "Let me be the judge of what I deserve," he said. "Andrew." "Stella." She stood up, not in retreat but in the way of someone who needs to move when they are feeling something large. And she walked to the window and looked out at the dark street for a moment and then turned back to him. And in her face was everything she had been keeping carefully controlled for 5 months. Not a storm exactly, but a weather system, large and complex and full of things that had been held in too long. "I am starting to feel things," she said, and the words cost her enormously, "that I did not think I would feel again. And I don't know what to do with them because the last time I felt things this way the person I felt them about died, and I was not adequate to surviving that. I survived it, but I was not adequate to it." She paused. "And you are asking me to risk that again?" He rose from his chair and he crossed the room to where she stood, and he stopped in front of her at a careful, respectful distance, close enough that she could see his face clearly in the low light. "I'm not asking you to risk anything tonight," he said. "Tonight I'm just asking you to know that I'm here, just that, nothing more." She looked up at him. She was not a small woman, but he was a tall man, and she had to look up slightly, and in doing so she felt something shift in her chest with a kind of inevitable gravitational quality, as though it had been moving in this direction for a long time and had simply arrived. "All right," she said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "All right, Andrew." He did not touch her. He simply stood there and let the proximity be what it was, warm and real and entirely patient. And after a moment she breathed out slowly and some of the rigid containment in her posture eased, and she said, with something that was almost humor and was the most open he had ever seen her, "You are profoundly inconvenient, you know." He smiled then, the full warm smile she had seen once before, and it did what it had done the first time it had been directed at her. "I've been told," he said. She laughed. It was a small laugh, startled out of her but genuine, and it changed the whole room. November brought the first frost, and then a week of freezing rain that turned the roads to mud and kept the town's residents close to their fires and each other. The school was closed for 2 days because the roof developed a new leak and required emergency repair, and Stella used these days to pay visits to her students' families, checking in on the Doan household, which by now was more stable but still needed occasional support, and stopping in at the homes of 2 of her younger students who she knew had been ill. During the freezing rain, Andrew came into town anyway, driving carefully through the mud, because his ranch needed supplies and also because he had spent 5 days without seeing Stella, and this had become a condition he found increasingly difficult to sustain. He arrived at the general store to find her there ahead of him, buying lamp oil and candles because the boarding house's supply had run low, and the sight of her in her heavy winter coat and the red scarf that Mrs. Cole had made her, standing at Otto Haas's counter with her shopping list in hand, did something to him that he was quite beyond pretending was simple friendship. "You drove in through this," she said, noting his coat which was streaked with mud. "I had business," he said, "in a freezing rain." "Supply needs don't check the weather," he said, and the look on her face said clearly that she knew perfectly well that supply needs had not been the primary motivation, and that she was not displeased by this and that she was not going to say so. She said instead, "Mrs. Cole will have coffee on. You should come warm up before driving back." He did. He came to the boarding house and Mrs. Cole fed him coffee and slices of the dried apple cake she had made the day before, and then, citing her knees, which she said predicted weather changes with unfailing accuracy, Mrs. Cole retired to her room and left them to the sitting room and the fire again, and this time the distance between them was shorter than it had been in October, not by much, but noticeably. Stella sat in her chair and he sat in his, and the fire was good, and the rain was a steady percussion on the windows, and she read to him from the book of poetry he had given her in September, because she had mentioned once that she found poetry worked better read aloud, and he sat with his coffee cup in both hands and listened to her read with the total, absorbed attention he gave everything that came from her. And there was something so quietly domestic and so entirely right about it that she felt it pressing warmly against all of her carefully maintained fortifications. She read 3 poems, and then she stopped and put the book down in her lap and looked at him. "Andrew," she said. He raised his eyes to hers. "I think I'm losing the argument I've been having with myself," she said. His expression did not change, but his eyes did, something moving in them warm and careful and held very steady. "What argument is that?" he said. "The one where I tell myself that what I feel when I'm with you is manageable and categorizable and not the kind of thing that requires me to change how I live," she said. "And is it losing conclusively?" he said. "I think so," she said. "Yes." He set his coffee cup down on the small table beside his chair, and he looked at her with everything he had been carrying for 7 months, patient and warm and absolutely unhurried. "What would you like to do about it?" he said. She looked at the fire for a moment and then back at him. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "I need a little more time." "You have all the time you need," he said. "I know," she said. "That is part of the problem." He did not quite smile, but something in his face was very close to it. "Tell me when you know," he said. "I will," she said. The rain continued its steady commentary on the windows, and they remained as they were, on either side of the fire, close enough that the warmth reached both of them easily, and neither of them moved and neither of them needed to. And the evening was very long and very quiet and entirely sufficient in itself. December came, and with it the weeks before Christmas, and Redemption Creek took on the cheerful, communal quality that small towns in the West acquired in the winter months, neighbors helping neighbors with firewood and food, the church organizing its Christmas program in which Stella's students would perform, and the general store receiving its annual shipment of small luxuries that people could not normally afford but purchased in December as gestures of warmth toward the people they loved. Stella threw herself into the Christmas school program with a focus that was partly genuine enthusiasm and partly a strategy for not thinking too hard about the conversation she had not yet had. Her students rehearsed a series of readings and a small nativity tableau, and she worked with them every afternoon until the week before Christmas, and the program when it was performed in the church was genuinely lovely, and the whole town came and the Doan children, who had been given parts and new clothes for the occasion through the quiet community effort that Stella had organized and refused to take credit for, stood up and recited their lines with a dignity that made their mother press her handkerchief hard against her eyes. Andrew was in the second row of the church pews with his sister Clara and Tom and the baby Thomas and James, and when the program was over and the town was milling about the church and the churchyard with candles and conversation, he found her at the edge of the churchyard where she had stepped to breathe a moment of cold air after the warmth and closeness of the room. "It was wonderful," he said. "Every bit of it." "The children did the work," she said. "You always say that," he said. "It's always true," she said. He stood beside her, their shoulders almost touching, and they looked up at the December sky, which was completely clear and absolutely full of stars, the kind of sky that Texas produces in winter that makes everything feel simultaneously very small and very vast. "I have something for you," he said, "for Christmas." He reached into his coat and brought out a small wrapped parcel, not much larger than his palm, wrapped in brown paper and tied with a bit of ribbon that had clearly been tied with inexpert but sincere effort. She took it from him and held it and looked at him. "I have something for you too," she said. "At the boarding house. I'll get it." "Open mine first," he said, and there was something in his voice that was not quite nervous but was in that direction, and she found she was moved by it. She unwrapped it carefully, and inside the paper was a small wooden box, clearly handmade, the wood smooth and fitted together with real care, and on the lid was a small carved design, a single flower, simple and well done. "Cole Briggs's son made the box," Andrew said. "He carves. I asked him to make something small enough to keep things in." He paused. "I put something inside it, but you can throw that out if you want." She opened the box. Inside, on a small square of folded cloth, was a ring. A simple, slim band of silver with a small dark blue stone in a modest setting. Nothing grand but beautiful in its simplicity. She stared at it for a long moment. Then she looked up at him. "Andrew," she said, and her voice was not quite steady. "I know," he said quickly. "I know you said you couldn't. I know I told you I wasn't pushing. I'm not putting this on your finger tonight unless you want it there. I'm not proposing in the way of telling you what you have to do. I'm just—" He stopped and started again. "I want you to have it, because I want you to know with something in your hand that's solid and real that I mean what I've been saying, that I'm here, that I'm not going anywhere. That if you find someday that what's been happening between us has grown into something you can name differently, I would like to be the man you name it with." The December stars were enormous above them, and the sound of the Christmas gathering came warmly from the church behind them, and Stella Whitfield stood in the cold and looked at the ring in the small carved box, and felt everything she had been careful about for so long arrive at a point from which there was simply nowhere further to be careful. "I told you I couldn't offer love," she said. "You did," he said. "I said it because I believed it. I know." She closed the box gently around the ring and looked up at him, and her eyes in the starlight were very bright and not from cold. "I think I was wrong," she said. He went very still. "I think something has been coming back," she said, slowly, "in a way I didn't recognize because I thought it was gone forever. But it's been coming back, Andrew." She pressed her lips together for a moment. "I don't know if it's the same as what I had before. I think it might be different. Quieter in some ways and bigger in others." She paused. "But it's love. I think it's love, and I think it belongs to you." Andrew Ellsworth stood in the December night outside a church in Redemption Creek, Texas, and looked at the woman who had just said the most important thing anyone had ever said to him, and he breathed in slowly and then let it out. And what was in his face was not triumph or satisfaction, but something far more complete than either of those things. "Stella," he said, and the word contained everything he had been waiting to say for 7 months. "Don't make a dramatic speech," she said, and her voice was rough with emotion and she was almost smiling. "I cannot handle a dramatic speech right now." "All right," he said softly. He reached out and took the hand that was not holding the box and held it, carefully, warmly, and completely. She let him. She held his hand back. They stood under the stars, and the warmth of the church came around the corner to find them, and the sounds of the Christmas gathering carried on without them. And none of it needed to be said because they were both saying it by standing there, holding on. She gave him his Christmas gift at the boarding house later that evening. It was a copy of a book on the history and geography of the eastern United States, detailed and well illustrated, ordered from a bookseller in San Antonio. He turned it over in his hands and ran his thumb across the spine and looked at her in a way that she recognized, because it was the same way she had felt about the book of poetry, that someone had listened to what she loved and had responded to it with genuine attention. "How did you know I'd like this?" he said. "Because I know you," she said simply. He looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," he said, "you do." They became officially courting in December, which in Redemption Creek meant that the town knew what had been obvious to them for months and could now openly celebrate it. Mrs. Cole was visibly delighted and made a special dinner. Cole Briggs gave Andrew considerable cheerful grief about it and then punched him warmly on the shoulder. The Reverend Holt shook Andrew's hand with great satisfaction and told Stella she had made a fine choice, and Stella, who was not accustomed to being told things like this, found it did not bother her as much as she expected. Andrew proposed formally on a Sunday in January 1879, taking Stella out to his ranch for the first time so she could see it, driving her out in the wagon bundled in blankets against the January cold, through a countryside that was brown and spare and beautiful in the way that winter landscape is beautiful, with all its structure visible, and its distances clear and unobscured. The ranch house was modest and solid, and he had clearly prepared for her visit, having cleaned it with a thoroughness that suggested considerable effort. It had a large main room with a good fireplace, a kitchen, 2 bedrooms, and a small room that he said had been used for storage, but that could be made into anything. He showed her all of it without pretension, just straightforward and honest. "This is what I have, this is where I live. They sat at the kitchen table with coffee, and he looked at her across the table and said, "I want to marry you, Stella, if you're willing. I want this to be your home, and I want to be your husband, and I want to build whatever comes next with you beside me." He paused. "I know that marriage is not something you came to lightly before, and I wouldn't ask it of you if I didn't mean it with every part of myself." Stella sat with her hands around her coffee cup and looked at the man across the table from her, and thought about everything the past 9 months had been, and everything she had thought about herself, and how much of it had turned out to be not the permanent truth she had believed it was, but a wound that had needed time and patience and the right kind of presence to come back to something close to whole. "Yes," she said. "Andrew, yes." He reached across the table and took both of her hands in his and looked at her with the whole of himself, and she looked back with the whole of herself, and it was one of those moments that does not announce itself as significant while it is happening, and yet contains everything. He took the ring from his jacket pocket, the same ring from the carved box in December, which she had kept in the box on her dresser since Christmas. "I thought I was going to keep it there forever," he said, looking at it and hoping. "You were remarkably patient," she said. "I told you," he said. "I meant what I said." He slid the ring onto her finger, and it fit exactly right, and she looked at it on her hand and felt it there. The weight of it, the solid, real, permanent weight of it, and she thought about the girl she had been in Richmond who had believed in love absolutely, and the woman she had become in the years after, and the woman she was now. Sitting in a ranch house kitchen in Texas in January of 1879, with a ring on her hand put there by a man who had loved her quietly and persistently, and without condition, until she had been able to love him back. And she felt these three versions of herself settle into the same place, all of them present, all of them accounted for, none of them lost. "I love you," she said, and it was the first time she had said it to him, and the words were simple and clear and had no hesitation in them at all. His hands tightened on hers. "I love you," he said. "I have for months." "I know," she said. "I could tell." He laughed, the full warm sound of it filling the kitchen, and she laughed with him. And outside, the January wind moved across the Texas hill country, and the ranch house held them inside its solid walls. And everything felt, for the first time in a very long time, like exactly enough. They were married in March of 1879, on a Saturday that the hill country provided with warm sunshine and blue sky, as though it had been ordered specifically. Reverend Holt performed the ceremony in the church, and the entirety of Redemption Creek attended, because the town had been invested in this outcome since the previous spring and felt entirely entitled to celebrate it. Mrs. Cole sat in the front row and wept with open happiness and did not apologize for it. Clara and Tom Waverly were there, Tom with baby Thomas on his hip, Clara squeezing her son James's hand with pride. Cole Briggs and the Ellsworth Ranch hands stood in a row at the back of the church, in their best clothes, looking scrubbed and uncomfortable and deeply pleased. Martha Doane was there with her 4 children, all of them in good condition now, the family firmly on their feet, and the oldest Doane girl, 17-year-old Ellen, who had become something of an apprentice teacher to Stella over the past months, stood with her hands folded and her chin up as though she were bearing witness to something she intended to remember. Stella wore a dress that Mrs. Cole and 3 other women of the town had made for her, ivory cotton with simple, careful detail, and her dark hair was down in a way she rarely wore it, loose and soft around her face. And when she walked up the aisle on Reverend Holt's arm, because she had no family in Texas to stand in that place, Andrew watched her come, and what was on his face was not merely happiness but something much larger and more serious. A man understanding that the best thing in his life is actually happening. She reached him and they stood facing each other, and she looked at him and he looked at her, and the whole church full of people and everything outside of it fell away for a moment, and it was just the 2 of them and the thing between them, which was no longer quiet or tentative or carefully managed but fully, warmly, completely present. "Ready," Reverend Holt said gently. Stella looked at Andrew and said, "Entirely." The vows were said with the simplicity and the weight that vows deserve, each word chosen and meant. And when it was finished and he kissed her gently and the church erupted into the particular enthusiastic celebration that a small town produces when it is genuinely delighted, she pressed her forehead briefly against his shoulder and let herself be held, fully and entirely, without any of the careful distance she had maintained for so long. "Hello, Mrs. Ellsworth," he said against her hair. "Hello, Mr. Ellsworth," she said, and there was everything in it. The humor and the warmth and the love and the relief and the absolute, solid happiness of a woman who has come all the way through something difficult and arrived, at last, somewhere real. They had the celebration at the church hall, with food contributed by half the town and music provided by a fiddler from one of the outlying homesteads who played with skill and energy until late afternoon. And they danced, Stella and Andrew, which was something she had not expected to do, and which turned out to be something he did well enough to make her laugh with surprise. And they moved around the church hall floor with the warmth of the afternoon coming through the windows and their neighbors and friends around them. And the whole thing was so uncomplicated and so joyful that Stella found herself simply allowing it to be what it was without analyzing it or preparing for its end. At the end of the afternoon, when the last of the guests had wished them well, and the Reverend Holt had shaken Andrew's hand for the third time and told Stella she was the best thing that had happened to the school and quite possibly the town, they drove out to the ranch in the wagon in the long golden evening light. Just the two of them, and the road was familiar to her now. She had driven it a dozen times in the months of their courtship, but it felt different today, because today she was going home. Stella settled into life at the Ellsworth Ranch with the same quiet, practical competence with which she had settled into everything else, but with something added now, a willingness to be comfortable that she had not allowed herself before. She kept teaching in town for the remainder of the school year, driving in 3 mornings a week while the spring term ran, and she arranged for Ellen Doan, who had a natural aptitude and a genuine interest, to begin more formally learning the work of teaching, with a plan to recommend her for a teaching certificate when she was ready. The ranch work interested her in ways she had not expected. She had grown up in Virginia, not on a farm but in a town, and cattle ranching was entirely new territory, but she approached it with the same curiosity she brought to everything, asking questions and listening to the answers, and learning the rhythms of the operation with genuine attention. Andrew watched her learn with a pride that he kept fairly quiet about but that Cole Briggs observed and noted with satisfaction. They had conversations in the evenings that continued to be the best part of both their days, long and wide-ranging, and full of the particular pleasure of two minds that work well in company with each other. They read together, sometimes aloud and sometimes in the same room in their own separate books with the fire going and the sounds of the ranch settling around them. And this particular domestic arrangement, quiet and entirely ordinary, was to Stella one of the most consistently profound pleasures of her new life. Andrew watched his wife move through their shared life and felt, every day, the particular and remarkable gratitude of a person who got what they hoped for when they had not been entirely sure it was possible. He had not been without hope exactly during those months of patient, careful friendship, but he had not been without doubt either, and the gap between what he had hoped for and what he had actually received was so small that it amazed him. She was everything he had understood her to be during the long courtship: intelligent, direct, capable, funny in a dry, unexpected way, intensely loyal once the loyalty had been given, and she loved him in a manner that was not operatic or demonstrative but was so thoroughly consistent and genuine that he felt it every hour of every day without needing it announced. Summer brought the news that Stella was expecting a child. She told him on a July morning in 1879, sitting at the kitchen table with her coffee going cold in front of her because she had forgotten to drink it, and he came in from the early chores and saw her face and stopped in the doorway. "Stella," he said. She looked up at him. Her expression was complex and he came to the table and sat across from her and waited. "I'm going to have a child," she said. "Our child. I think sometime in the winter, February or thereabouts." He took her hands across the table in the way he had on the day he proposed. He did not speak for a moment because the moment was larger than speech. "How are you feeling?" he said finally. "About all of it, everything about it." Looked down at their joined hands and then back up at his face. "Frightened," she said honestly. "Not the ordinary kind of frightened, the other kind." He understood immediately. "Because of before." "Yes," she said, "because of before. We're going to take care of you," he said. "Every step, everything that can be done will be done." He held her hands more firmly. "And what can't be done we'll face together, whatever comes." She breathed in slowly and then out. "I know," she said. "I know that." She paused. "I'm also happy," she said, as though she needed to include this, as though it might not be obvious. "Underneath the frightened, I'm very happy." "Good," he said, and he raised her hands and pressed them against his mouth and held them there for a moment, and she felt it travel from her hands all the way through her. The pregnancy was carefully attended. Andrew drove her into town to see the doctor, a mild-mannered man named Dr. Bauer, who had come to Redemption Creek from Kansas, monthly and then more frequently as winter approached. And Dr. Bauer pronounced her health good and the pregnancy progressing well, and told Andrew more than once that his wife was one of the most sensible patients he had because she listened to advice and followed it without argument. Stella, when Andrew relayed this, said that she listened to sensible advice from sensible sources, and it was not a matter of being particularly cooperative, which made Dr. Bauer laugh when Andrew told him, and which caused the doctor to declare that sensible and direct were an excellent combination, and the town was lucky to have her. Clara Waverly became a dear friend during the pregnancy, coming out to the ranch or receiving Stella in town, with the warmth and practicality of a woman who had herself recently navigated childbirth and understood what information was actually useful. They talked frankly and at length about what to expect, and Clara's company during these months was something Stella valued more than she easily expressed, though Clara understood this without needing it explained. James Waverly continued to be one of Stella's best students. Under the combination of Andrew's patient mentorship and Stella's rigorous and respectful teaching, the boy had grown into a confident, thoughtful 12-year-old who read widely and thought carefully, and was considering, with Andrew's encouragement, what his future might look like in terms of education. The child arrived on the 7th of February, 1880, in the middle of a cold, clear night with Dr. Bauer and Mrs. Cole in attendance and Andrew pacing the front room of the ranch house with a patience that was entirely uncharacteristic of him, his composure having abandoned him completely somewhere around midnight. It was a boy, a healthy, strong-voiced, very definite boy who arrived with a quantity of dark hair and immediately made his presence in the world thoroughly clear. Andrew was brought in and he went to Stella first, who was exhausted and entirely present, and looked at him with eyes that were wet and warm and contained absolutely everything. And he sat beside her and pressed his forehead against hers and could not for a long moment speak. "He's well, doctor," Bauer said cheerfully from across the room. "Strong lungs, good weight. Your wife did excellently." "I know," Andrew said, and his voice was not quite steady. Stella put the baby in his arms and he held his son with the careful, awed concentration of a man experiencing something that has reorganized his entire understanding of what is important, and the baby looked up at him with the vague, profound gaze of the very newly arrived, and Andrew looked back. "What do we name him?" Stella said softly. Andrew had been thinking about this for weeks. He looked at his son and then at his wife and said, "What about Daniel? Daniel James Ellsworth." The middle name for James, her favorite student, her husband's nephew, the small boy whose mother's pride and father's hard year and grandfather's poverty had somehow been part of the chain of circumstance that had brought her and Andrew together. Stella's eyes filled again. "Yes," she said, "Daniel James." Daniel James Ellsworth grew through 1880 with the vigorous, demanding, entirely absorbing quality of a healthy baby who has decided that the world should attend to him. And the Ellsworth Ranch organized itself around this new center of gravity with considerable willingness. Cole Briggs, who was a bachelor without children, became inexplicably devoted to the baby and could regularly be found holding him in the yard or singing something tuneless and enthusiastic to him in the barn, which the other ranch hands pretended not to notice, and which Stella thought was one of the most charming things she had ever witnessed. Mrs. Cole came out to the ranch regularly and contributed her expertise in all things domestic and infant-related with enormous satisfaction. Clara Waverly brought her Thomas, now a lively toddler, and James, who had become something of a devoted older cousin to Daniel almost immediately, and the ranch on Sunday afternoons had a warmth and density of family life that Andrew had hoped for so long he had occasionally wondered if it was something he was capable of achieving. In the spring of 1880, Stella returned to teaching, this time in a reduced capacity, 2 mornings per week, while Ellen Doan, who had passed her teaching certificate examination with marks that Stella had described privately to Andrew as exceptional, took on the primary role. Stella remained as a mentor and collaborator rather than the primary teacher, and this arrangement worked beautifully, giving the school continuity and giving Stella the ability to be both the teacher she was and the mother she was becoming with considerable enjoyment. Ellen Doan, now 20 and steady and capable beyond her years, had become both Stella's professional legacy in Redemption Creek and in the quiet way of the frontier, a young woman finding her own footing, her family now fully stable, her mother proud, her siblings thriving. Stella watched Ellen stand at the front of the schoolroom one April morning and looked at this young woman who had arrived in Redemption Creek 2 years ago, thin and watchful, and without much in the way of obvious prospects, and felt a satisfaction that was specific and deep and entirely earned. Andrew and Stella had a conversation that spring about the future of the ranch and what they both wanted it to be in the years ahead. He had an opportunity to purchase an additional 200 acres adjacent to his existing land, which would make the operation significantly larger and more viable long-term. The cost was substantial and would require careful management of their finances for the next several years. He laid it all out for her, income and expenditure and risk and potential, and she listened and asked several very good questions about the grazing capacity and the water sources on the new land. And after a thorough conversation, they agreed it was the right decision, and he made the purchase. This was the way they made decisions. Together, with full information, with respect for each other's thinking, with a willingness to say when they disagreed, and to work through it to something they both believed in. It was not always easy, because both of them had strong minds and clear opinions, and there were occasional evenings where the conversation became something more like an argument before it resolved itself into something workable. But these moments, even the harder ones, had a quality of genuine engagement that neither of them had ever had before, the quality of being truly known by the person you are disagreeing with, which changes everything about how the disagreement feels. Summer of 1880 was hot and golden and good. The cattle operation prospered. Daniel grew from a baby into a small person with opinions and Andrew's dark eyes and Stella's dry, thoughtful expression, a combination that both parents found endlessly entertaining. The Ellsworth Ranch on a summer evening, with Daniel running in the yard and the horses in the paddock, and the sound of the distant cattle and the big sky holding its light until very late, had a quality that Stella found she could not adequately describe to anyone who had not been there, but that she stopped needing to describe because she was simply in it, which was better. In the fall of 1881, Stella discovered she was expecting again. She told Andrew in the same kitchen, at the same table, with a coffee going cold in front of her for the same reason, and he looked at her from the doorway with the same attention and came to sit across from her with the same quality of presence. "How are you feeling?" he said. "Less frightened this time," she said. "More excited." She paused, though still a little frightened. "That's reasonable," he said. "I think it's a girl," she said, and she said it with a kind of certainty that had no logical basis but that he received with complete seriousness. "Tell me why you think so," he said. "I don't know exactly," she said. "I just think so." She was right. In March of 1882, their daughter arrived, small and fierce and possessed from the first moment of a quality that Mrs. Cole described as thoroughly her mother's. They named her Clara Rose Ellsworth, the first name for Andrew's sister, and Stella looked at her daughter in the firelight of the ranch house bedroom and felt something complete itself in her that she had believed was shattered beyond repair. And she wept with a relief and a joy that she did not try to contain or manage or explain. Daniel, at 2 years old, was fascinated by his sister, with the complete and focused interest of a small boy encountering something new that he has decided is his. He stood beside the cradle and looked at Clara with an expression of proprietorial wonder and said, in his 2-year-old speech, something that Andrew interpreted as mine and Stella interpreted as wow, and that was probably both. Redemption Creek in 1882 had grown somewhat. The railroad spur that had been discussed for years had come close enough to matter, a connection at the town of Hartley, 12 miles east, which improved the ability to move cattle to market and brought in some additional commerce and a handful of new families. The school had expanded to 18 students and was thriving under Ellen Doan's primary leadership, and the community had the feel of a place that was building itself carefully and with some genuine success. Andrew had become one of the more established ranchers in the area, respected for his honesty and his good management, and Stella had become someone the community turned to when it needed someone thoughtful and effective and invested, whether for the school or for community efforts like the one that had helped the Doans, or simply for a voice that was reliably clear and fair. She had, without having planned it, become a person central to the life of a town that she had arrived in planning to pass through. She thought about this one October evening in 1882, sitting on the porch of the ranch house with Clara asleep in the cradle beside her and Daniel inside with Andrew, who was teaching him, with considerable patience and good humor, the rudiments of checkers. The evening was warm and the hill country stretched away in every direction in the particular amber and brown of Texas autumn, and the horses moved in the paddock, and somewhere Cole Briggs was moving around the barn doing the last of the evening's work, and she could hear Andrew's voice from inside explaining the rules of checkers to a not-quite 3-year-old, and Daniel's voice asking something back with absolute seriousness. And the ranch house lamp was on behind her, and the baby was asleep in the cradle she had made by the evening, and all of it was real, all of it was here, all of it was hers. She thought about the stage arriving in Redemption Creek in April of 1878. She thought about walking down the main street with her carpetbag and her hat and her careful, forward-facing determination to feel nothing more than necessary. She thought about nearly being walked into by a man coming out of a general store with a sack of flour on his shoulder, and how unremarkable that had seemed, how ordinary and incidental, and how it had been neither. She thought about saying, "I cannot offer love," and she thought about what had been said back to her, "Let me offer enough for both of us." She thought about how she had believed with the conviction of genuine experience that the capacity for love was something that could be used up, spent out, left behind in a Richmond winter with 2 unbearable losses. She had not been lying when she said it. She had believed it entirely. She had been wrong. Not wrong about the losses, not wrong about what they had cost, not wrong about how long and how hard the recovery had been, but wrong about the conclusion, wrong about the finality of it. Love, it turned out, was not a fixed quantity that could be exhausted. It was something more like a source, and what she had experienced in those years of quiet, careful, patient, persistent Andrew Ellsworth was not the restoration of what she had lost, but the discovery that the source itself was still there, deeper than the grief had reached, waiting with an extraordinary patience that she had not quite matched but had eventually found her way to. She had told him she could not offer it. She had been offering it for 4 years now. In the way she looked at him across the breakfast table, and the way she argued with him when she disagreed, and the way she held his hand in church, and the way she called him in from the yard with a voice that had no professional distance in it at all, and the way she had said his name when Daniel was born, and the way she had pressed her forehead against his on their wedding morning in the church hall, and the way she lay beside him at night in the ranch house with the Texas night outside the windows and felt, in a way that required no analysis and no qualification and no management whatsoever, entirely at home. The door opened behind her and Andrew came out onto the porch, stepping carefully so as not to wake the baby, and he settled into the chair beside hers and looked out at the evening with her. "Daniel's asleep," he said quietly. "Already? Fell asleep in the middle of explaining to me why his checker move was correct," he said. "I carried him in." She smiled in the darkness. "He's so much like you," she said. "He's so much like you," Andrew said, with the certainty of a man who has given this a great deal of thought. They sat together in the October evening, and the ranch was quiet around them, and the baby slept in the cradle, and the stars were beginning to appear in the big Texas sky. "Andrew," she said. She turned her head to look at him. He was looking out at the evening, his profile familiar and dear and hers entirely hers. "I want to tell you something," she said. He turned to her. "I was thinking about when I came to town," she said, "when we met, what I said to you that night at the boarding house about not being able to offer love." "I remember," he said. "I want you to know," she said, "that I was telling the truth as I understood it. And I want you to know that you were also telling the truth when you said what you said back, that you'd offer enough for both of us." She looked at him. "And I want you to know that, because of everything you did with that patience of yours, which I know I made very difficult, I got back something I thought was gone." She paused. "I got myself back, I think, and I got to have this." He looked at her for a long time. The evening was very still around them. "I didn't do anything extraordinary," he said. "You stayed," she said. "When everything in my manner was giving you reasons to go, you stayed." She paused. "That was extraordinary." He reached across and took her hand where it lay on the arm of the chair, and he held it in his warm, capable hand, the hand she had come to know as well as her own. "You would have found your way back," he said. "You're the most capable person I know." "I wouldn't have found my way to here," she said. "Not without you." He squeezed her hand. "Then I'm glad I stayed," he said. Clara stirred in her cradle and made a small sound and settled again, and the horses moved in the paddock, and the stars continued their appearance above the hill country in the serious, unhurried way they always did. And Stella Whitfield Ellsworth sat on the porch of her home in the October evening with her husband's hand in hers, with her daughter sleeping beside her and her son asleep inside, and the whole of this life that she had not known she was going to have spread out in every direction around her. Solid and real and deeply, completely good. She thought, "I came here to rest." She thought, "I found something better." She thought, "I found out that love is not a thing that gets used up. It is a thing that comes back, if you give it enough time and the right company and the particular grace of someone who means what he says." And she tightened her hand around Andrew's and he tightened his around hers, and the evening was quiet, and the stars were many, and the ranch house lamp burned behind them in the Texas dark, a small warm light that could be seen from quite a distance, which is exactly what a light is for. Spring came again to Redemption Creek in 1883, and with the spring came a letter for Stella from a women's educational society in Austin that had heard of her work in frontier education and the system she had developed for training new teachers in small communities, a reference to what she had done with Ellen Doan, which had become something of a model worth discussing. The letter asked if she would be willing to correspond with them about her methods and potentially attend a conference in Austin in the fall. She brought the letter to Andrew over breakfast and watched his face as he read it, and when he looked up at her, his expression was proud and pleased in a completely uncomplicated way. "You should go," he said immediately. "It's a long journey," she said. 4 days, he said, "each way. The conference is 3 days. I can manage things here." "Daniel and Clara," she said. "Clara and I have an understanding," he said, which made her laugh because Clara Rose Ellsworth, at 14 months old, had a personality so definite that understanding was perhaps exactly the right word. "And Daniel would enjoy helping me show her the ranch." Stella looked at the letter and then at him. "I'd like to go," she said. "I think what we worked out here with Ellen might actually be useful to other places." "It is useful," he said. "You built something here. People should know about it." She looked at him. "You know," she said, "most men would find it inconvenient to have a wife who wants to go to Austin for a conference." "Most men are not married to you," he said simply, and returned to his breakfast as though this were entirely self-evident. She went to Austin in October of 1883 and presented to the Women's Educational Society a clear and practical account of what she had developed in Redemption Creek, the methods, the mentorship model, the community integration, and the specific results. She was received with genuine enthusiasm, and she returned to Redemption Creek after 11 days away with 3 new professional connections, 2 invitations to correspond with teachers in other frontier communities, and a level of satisfaction in her professional self that added another dimension to the already rich life she was living. Andrew met her at the stage when she returned, with Daniel at his side holding very seriously to his father's hand, and Clara on his hip looking at the arriving passengers with the supreme confidence of someone who expects to find who she is looking for. When Stella stepped down from the stage and Clara saw her, she said, with perfect clarity and enormous volume, "Mama," and lunged toward her with such enthusiasm that Andrew nearly lost his grip, and Stella caught her daughter and held her close and pressed her face into Clara's hair, and felt the particular overwhelming quality of coming back to the people you belong to. Daniel stood beside his father and regarded his mother's return with the composed satisfaction of a 3-year-old who has managed well in her absence and wants this known. "Hello, Daniel," Stella said, shifting Clara to one arm and crouching to his level. "I fed the horses," he said, "every day. Did you?" "Papa said I helped considerably," he said, with the precise dignity of a boy who has been given an adult phrase and is using it correctly. "I'm very proud of you," she said, and meant it, and he walked into her embrace with the ease of a child who has never doubted its welcome. Andrew waited until the children had had their moment, and then he met her eyes over their heads, and what was in his face was everything. "Welcome back. I missed you. I'm proud of you. This is home. You are home." All of it in the simple, direct look of a man who does not need many words when the right ones are available. "Good conference," he said. "Very good," she said. "Tell me everything on the way home," he said. "All of it," she said. "It might take the whole drive." "We have the whole drive," he said, and he took her bag and loaded it into the wagon and helped her up and settled Daniel between them and put Clara in Stella's lap and turned the horses for the ranch road. And Stella began talking, and he listened in the particular way. He always listened to her, with every part of his attention. And the road home unrolled before the horses through the Texas afternoon, and the hill country spread itself out around them in the mellow golden light of a fall that was not yet cold enough to be uncomfortable. And the children asked questions and got in the way of the conversation and required management. And it was all thoroughly normal and thoroughly alive and thoroughly right. Years would pass. Daniel would grow into a serious, capable boy who loved books and horses with equal passion, and who at 7 could already ride with a natural ease that made his father proud, and caused his mother to stand in the ranch yard watching him and feel a heart so full it was almost difficult to contain. Clara, fierce and bright and possessed of a laugh that could be heard halfway across the ranch, would develop into her own particular self, curious about everything and afraid of very little, the combination of her parents' qualities in a proportion that was entirely her own. The Ellsworth Ranch would grow into something solid and established, respected in the area, run with the same quiet competence that Andrew had always brought to it, and that Stella's particular gift for organization and clear thinking had refined and strengthened. The town of Redemption Creek would grow too, slowly and steadily, adding a second doctor and a proper newspaper, and a larger church building that leaned somewhat less dramatically to the east than its predecessor. Ellen Doan would teach there for many years, and the school would become known in the region as an unusually good one, and people would ask how it had gotten that way, and Ellen would explain about the system she had been trained in, and the woman who had trained her, and the woman who had come to Redemption Creek in 1878 on a stage from San Antonio with a carpetbag and a gray-eyed, forward-facing determination that was actually a woman in the process of becoming who she was meant to be. And on a particular evening in the autumn of 1886, when the children were asleep and the ranch house was quiet and the fire was good and the Texas night was doing what it always did outside the windows, Stella Ellsworth sat in the sitting room across from her husband, a book open in her lap and his own book open in his, and the lamp made a warm circle of light around them both. And she looked up from her page and looked at him, and he happened to look up at the same moment, and they looked at each other across the firelit room with the complete, uncomplicated knowledge of two people who know each other entirely, and have chosen each other every day for 8 years, and intend to keep doing so. Neither of them said anything. There was nothing that needed saying that was not already said by the simple fact of this: the fire, the books, the sleeping children, the 8 years, the love that had been offered by one and slowly, carefully, wondrously found its way back in the other, and the whole long life ahead of them still, unfolding in the direction of the good. She went back to her book. He went back to his. The fire burned on in the Texas night, and everything was well.